For hundreds of years, racism has been a prevalent subject in modern society, with complexion being the main reason for social division. Over the years, racism has slowly shown itself in many historical settings, taking the form of jokes, comments, verbal abuse, commentary in media, or to the very extreme, racial propaganda in countries. In recent news, after the death of George Floyd, the hashtag Black Lives Matter exploded into mainstream media. Millions have partaken in protests against police brutality and systematic racism. Celebrities have also taken part in protests and social media actions in hopes of taking down racism. But what is racism? As defined by Oxford Languages, racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or persons on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority. My research question: how has casual racism been perpetuated by Australian society, and how does it affect Asian Australians? Will cover the many aspects of racism. To start off, let's define casual racism. The term casual racism has emerged from the last couple of years in media coverage, reporting on more extreme forms of interpersonal racism. These incidents occur on seemingly casual basis. Casual racism is racially insensitive behavior that often goes unnoticed in everyday interactions. Often hard to spot, casual racism is now so common and normalized that it forms a part of our daily lives. Casual racism can include jokes or statements that negatively highlight cultural differences such as physical appearance, cultural practices, or accents, and it can be expressed through beliefs, prejudice, or behaviors that we sometimes don't realize. The media today focus on more obvious experiences of racism. In reality, racism occurs every day in the most blatant and subtle forms. Subtle forms of racism can often go unnoticed by the general public, and therefore go unaddressed. Subtle forms of racism refer to what researchers have decided to call everyday racism, or casual racism. And this term has been used since the early 1990s. Everyday racism is so common now that it is infused in daily conversation through jokes and stereotypes or through unconscious body gestures or expressions. Here I have 3 instances of racism. Our 3 victims called Racism No Way, and they have anonymously recounted their experiences. Male, aged 12, is being teased and has had threats of violence from kids at school because of his Asian background. He has said that teasing also occurs outside school by adults as well as kids. Female, aged 14, says that she is often harassed by her peers for having dark skin. She has no friends and often feels bad about herself when others put herself down. Male, aged 13, is constantly bullied about his Aboriginal background. His brother is also harassed. The students involved have been asked to stop, have been suspended, and their parents consulted. However, the parents have been found to also harass Aboriginal people. Referring to these experiences of racism as casual only diminishes their importance. Casual suggests irregular, which is inaccurate and also implies we do not need to take this type of racism too seriously. Therefore, it is preferred to not use the term and instead draw attention to the persistent and prevalence of everyday forms of racism in its cumulative effect shows the ongoing experience of marginalization and repression can be a heavy burden, with future incidents triggering trauma of the past. Now let's talk about Australia's problem with casual racism. Australian political leaders have spoken out against racism many times. There have been commentators that have retorted that it's fear, not racism. This common phrase highlights a continuation of casual racism that is involving the negative stereotypes that surround people on the basis of race, color, or ethnicity. To these commentators, racism stems from the actions of bad individuals with malice or hatred, rather than being caused by a combination of prejudice or institutional power. This misunderstanding makes racism harder to combat. Former Race Discrimination Commissioner Tim Soutphommasane has noted this problem, suggesting that calling out racism is often deemed to be worse than the act itself. What about the recent influx of hate crimes against Asian Australians? The recent COVID-19 pandemic has shown an influx of hate crimes against Asians. Asian Australians have been physically harassed, verbally harassed, and been told Asians need to stay indoors. A community survey launched on the 2nd of April by the community group the Asian Australian Alliance, AAA, tracks racist incidents related to the coronavirus pandemic. It received 377 reports of racism in 2 months, an equivalent of 47 racist encounters a week. Women were overwhelmingly the most frequent victims, being 65% of the respondents. 40% of these racist incidents happened on public streets, and 60% of incidents involved physical or verbal harassment. Racial abuse was committed by a stranger in 84% of reported cases, and 90% did not even report the incidents to the police. What does this information tell us? It tells us that women are the most frequent victims of racial assault. This data also shows us that 84% of reported cases were done by strangers. But why is this the case? I believe that the perpetrator wants to inflict harm on Asian people. But they either do not know many Asian people, so they choose the first Asian they see, or they do not wish to hurt their own friend. The data also shows that 90% of people did not report the incident to police. I think this is due to the negative stereotypes that surround Asian people. Supposedly, Asian people are insensitive and cannot take a joke when it comes to racial matters. From conducting my research, I've come across a plethora of policy recommendations that can help solve racial matters in Australia. These recommendations aim to mitigate against the specific COVID-19 related racism and xenophobia we're currently experiencing right now. Firstly, the Commonwealth Government should fund a national anti-racism campaign and educational program to improve community understanding about what is racism and discrimination. These programs should be aimed at younger children and adults so then families cannot build on racial tendencies at the start. Secondly, social media platforms should be required to make it easier to report and remove trending content confirmed to be false that may encourage COVID-19 related racism or racism as a whole. Individuals who share removed content should be directly notified by platforms so they can know that the content was verified to be false. And finally, online reporting tools should be used by civil society groups to track instances of racism and discrimination against all ethnic minority groups. Here, the government should be also provide support to hate crime victims, as they would with any other kind of victim. To conclude, people aren't born with racist ideas or attitudes. Racism is simply something that is learned and built upon in the early years and in the environment an individual grows in. There remain a small minority of people who believe that races are superior to others, while most people in Australia today accept the diversity in our society. Some also believe that racial groups should not mix. A belief in racial superiority or purity can lead to racial hatred. However, not all racism comes from hate. Some of it comes from fear and anxiety. People may worry that some groups pose a threat, whether to the safety of our community or to the national identity. What about our society? What does our government think? Frankly, they simply do not care. If it is not directly economically beneficial for the country, why would the government care? After all, it isn't as if implementing strict laws on racism will lower the abuse victims face. Right? Wrong. Take gun laws in Australia. With these gun laws, there have been minimal misuse of guns. However, in America, where we can see they have very little gun laws surrounding the gun policy in America, we can see a multitude of school shootings that reach across the globe and other misconducts. What about the general public? Professor Dunn conducted a survey that shines light on issues that deserve attention too. The following statement, Dunn states, "Some of the hopeful findings in our survey that 80% of Australians see cultural diversity as a really positive thing. So that's a great finding. And by the same token, about the same proportion, 80% acknowledge there's a problem with racism. And the same proportion again say something that should be done about racism. So there's a strong community, strong public support for action against racism. The racism which is unfairly distributed across ethnic groups in our country. So to answer the question, How has casual racism been perpetuated by Australian society, and how does it affect Asian Australians? Australian society has seen racism as a problem, but have not yet done anything to prevent it. Asian Australians specifically are the main targets of casual racism. Today, Asians are often seen as a model minority, hardworking, academically talented, and professionally successful. But it wasn't always that way. In the 18th century, Asian people were classified as Mongolians, a racial term based on the pseudoscience craniolometry. White people were deemed as full human beings with superiority intellect, while other people of color, were considered underevolved. By late 19th century, we saw a new image of Asian people: national threat. Chinese immigrants were seen as economic threat to white Australian workers, and Japan became a military threat during World War II. Asian people in Australia continue to experience racism even today. In fact, the model minority idea has always been a way to pit Asian people against their achievements. It finds the excuse which implies, if Asians can do it, why can't you? By implementing the solutions I previously mentioned, we as society can work together to build a community where all are included.